The night had a peculiar stillness in Brooklyn, a hush that seemed to settle over the streets like a heavy velvet curtain. Streetlights cast a soft, golden glow over cracked sidewalks, illuminating the occasional flicker of neon signs from corner stores long after closing hours. The faint hum of distant traffic punctuated the quiet, and somewhere, a lone siren wailed, fading into the darkness. It was in this ordinary, almost sleepy urban landscape that the story of Joe Massino, one of the most remarkable figures in the history of organized crime, began to take shape. To the casual observer, these streets were simply neighborhoods filled with families, children playing under porch lights, and the occasional late-night wanderer. Yet beneath the calm, beneath the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, currents of ambition, loyalty, and danger flowed unseen, shaping destinies in ways only those who lived within them could understand. Joseph Massino would come to be known as the boss of bosses, though in the beginning, he was simply another boy navigating the complexities of his environment, learning lessons in survival from the whispers of elders, the warnings of neighborhood toughs, and the small, almost imperceptible hierarchies that governed everyday life. From the earliest moments, the dichotomy of Massino's world was evident. On one side, there was family, tradition, and community, simple, tangible, comforting elements that provided structure and identity. On the other side, there was the shadowed allure of the underworld, a place where respect was earned not through words or deeds in the classroom, but through strength, cunning, and sometimes ruthless action. This duality would define Massino's life, the careful balance between ordinary human desire for safety and the extraordinary hunger for power. Brooklyn in the post-war years was a mosaic of cultures, with Italian neighborhoods retaining the cadence of their old-world roots even as modern America crept in through radios, television sets, and new businesses. Massino's family, like many others, clung to their heritage, passing down values of loyalty, honor, and discipline. Yet these same streets whispered temptations to young men seeking to carve out a name for themselves in a world that often seemed indifferent to effort or talent. Joe observed closely. He listened to conversations, noted the interactions between adults, and began to internalize the unspoken rules of respect, hierarchy, and survival. The lessons were subtle, delivered not in lectures but in the rhythm of everyday life, the quiet nod to a respected neighbor, the careful avoidance of a dangerous rival, the coded signals of warning when tensions rose between factions in the neighborhood. Even as a child, Massino displayed a calm, deliberate awareness that set him apart. While other boys might have been drawn impulsively into mischief or street games, he measured his actions, considering consequences and potential gains with a clarity that would later become legendary in the mafia world. The streets themselves became a classroom, teaching lessons no formal school could offer. Observing interactions between local gangs, understanding how authority operated outside the law, and noting the subtle shifts in power that occurred almost imperceptibly, he was absorbing a curriculum in human behavior and survival strategy. Every whispered warning, every wary glance exchanged between grown men in dimly lit storefronts, contributed to an understanding of the delicate balance between respect and fear, loyalty and betrayal. The environment that surrounded him was both nurturing and dangerous. Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods offered a strong sense of community, yet they were also arenas of territorial disputes and simmering rivalries. This duality required young Massino to develop a sense of discretion, a quiet attentiveness to signals others might overlook. It was here, in the tension between normalcy and hidden menace, that the seeds of his later approach to leadership were planted. The calm streets at night, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant echoes of everyday life created a rhythm that masked the deeper currents of ambition flowing beneath the surface. Yet Massino learned to see beyond the ordinary, to perceive the subtle interplay of influence, power, and fear, a skill that would eventually define him as a boss capable of commanding loyalty and respect in equal measure. By the time he reached adolescence, the allure of the underworld had grown stronger, though Massino approached it not with reckless abandon but with calculated observation. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of missteps, small-time criminals who acted without thinking, families torn apart by betrayal, and the constant, unspoken threat of violence that underpinned every transaction. He understood that survival depended not on brute strength alone, but on patience, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate the moves of others. In these formative years, the young boy who had once been simply part of the neighborhood began to cultivate the qualities that would later mark him as one of the most astute and disciplined figures in organized crime. Even at this early stage, a pattern emerged in Massino's approach to life, a preference for observation over action, for strategic patience over impulsive engagement. The streets of Brooklyn at night became his classroom, and the lessons he learned there were indelibly imprinted on his character. He noted who commanded respect and why, who thrived in chaos and who crumbled under pressure. He understood that appearances could be deceiving, that charisma and fear were often intertwined, and that alliances were as fragile as the whispered promises that created them. Every interaction, every encounter, every quiet moment of reflection contributed to an understanding of human behavior that would later allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of the mafia with remarkable skill. The early environment, though seemingly ordinary, was a crucible of sorts, shaping a mind capable of both ruthlessness and careful calculation. While other boys might have sought immediate gratification, Massino learned the value of delayed action, the importance of timing, and the subtle power of patience. These lessons, absorbed in quiet observation and careful reflection, would later become the foundation of his leadership style, disciplined, strategic, and consistently forward-thinking. The calm streets of Brooklyn at night, the distant glow of streetlights, and the muted sounds of a living neighborhood all contributed to a sensory tapestry in which a young boy learned to read the world, anticipate danger, and act with precision. As the story of Joe Massino begins to unfold, it is essential to recognize this early duality, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the calm and the looming threat, the lessons of family and the seductive whispers of power. These elements intertwine to form a young man who would eventually rise to command one of the most powerful crime families in New York. But the question that hangs quietly over this narrative, almost like a whisper in the night, is how a man so deeply entrenched in the world of crime could later choose survival over ambition, loyalty over tradition, and discretion over notoriety. It is a question that invites curiosity and reflection, setting the stage for a journey that is at once historical, psychological, and deeply human. Even now, as the night deepens and Brooklyn's streets grow quieter, one can almost sense the latent tension, the subtle currents of power and fear, and the quiet determination of a young boy who would learn to navigate it all. The story of Joe Massino is not simply a tale of crime and ambition, it is a story of observation, patience, and the careful cultivation of intelligence, set against the backdrop of ordinary life where the extraordinary quietly waited to emerge. As the night stretches on, the audience is gently drawn into this world, feeling the stillness, sensing the tension beneath the calm, and preparing to follow a man whose life will become a complex tapestry of power, loyalty, danger, and survival. It is a story that begins in quiet observation but will unfold into drama, intrigue, and profound lessons about human nature, choices, and the consequences that inevitably follow. Brooklyn in the 1930s and 1940s was a place of contrasts, a neighborhood alive with energy yet quietly shaped by traditions handed down from immigrant families. Italian families, like Joe Massino's, sought to preserve the values of their homeland even as they adapted to the rhythms of American life. In this mosaic of post-war Brooklyn, streets hummed with the chatter of neighbors, children's laughter, and the smells of home-cooked meals wafting from kitchens. The familiar sounds of vendors calling out their wares blended with the occasional rumble of trolley cars and the far-off wail of a siren. For young Massino, these streets were more than just a home, they were a living classroom, a place where lessons in human behavior, loyalty, and survival were imparted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Family was the cornerstone of Massino's early world. His parents, like many first-generation immigrants, held tight to the values of respect, honor, and hard work. Dinners were more than meals, they were lessons in etiquette, storytelling, and the importance of social bonds. Through family gatherings, Massino learned to observe people, understand their motivations, and recognize the delicate interplay of affection and authority. His Sicilian heritage carried with it an unspoken code: loyalty was paramount, respect was earned, and betrayal was a stain that could never be washed away. Even at a young age, Massino internalized these principles, not through formal instruction but by watching, listening, and participating in the rhythm of everyday life. The neighborhood itself played a significant role in shaping his worldview. Brooklyn's streets were alive with microcosms of power and influence, each corner and alleyway carrying its own set of rules. Young boys played stickball in the streets, darting between parked cars and shouting in unison, yet in the shadows, older men observed, gauging character and potential. The neighborhood functioned as a delicate ecosystem, where respect and reputation mattered as much as family ties. It was a place where lessons in survival were woven into the fabric of ordinary life: who walked where, whom to avoid, and when to speak versus remain silent. For Massino, understanding this landscape was crucial. He was not simply moving through streets, he was decoding an intricate social network that would serve him well in the years to come. Education in the formal sense was a component, but the lessons that left the deepest imprint were learned beyond the classroom. Massino absorbed the unspoken rules of interaction, watching how men conducted themselves in crowded cafes, how elders settled disputes with quiet authority, and how alliances shifted subtly over time. There was an artistry to these interactions, a balance between patience and assertiveness that could determine one's place in the hierarchy. Even small incidents, an argument over territory, a dispute about a debt, or the manner in which respect was shown to a visiting elder, carried significance. Massino's keen observational skills allowed him to understand both the overt and covert structures of authority, giving him a perspective that few of his peers possessed. The environment was not without its dangers. Brooklyn was a patchwork of opportunity and risk, where petty crime, territorial disputes, and the occasional outbreak of violence were ever present. Massino's early exposure to these tensions did not come through formal confrontation but through careful observation. He watched boys older than himself navigate risky situations, learning who would bluff and who would strike, who could be trusted and who could not. In this way, the streets served as both a playground and a training ground, teaching lessons about timing, discretion, and the consequences of impulsive actions. Even in moments that seemed ordinary, there was a lesson to be learned: how to read people, how to anticipate threats, and how to act decisively without attracting unwanted attention. Beyond the immediate neighborhood, the broader social fabric of Brooklyn influenced Massino's development. Italian-American communities at the time were tightly knit, emphasizing family honor, religious observance, and communal responsibility. Festivals, church gatherings, and local clubs provided a structured rhythm to life, reinforcing moral codes while also offering opportunities for networking and influence. Within these spaces, young Massino began to understand the interplay between community loyalty and individual ambition. He saw how families built reputations, how connections could provide safety and opportunity, and how missteps could carry lasting consequences. These early lessons in social navigation were foundational, cultivating a sense of patience and foresight that would later define his approach to leadership in the underworld. Even as the warmth of family and community enveloped him, Massino became aware of the seductive allure of power and influence. Stories of local figures who commanded respect and even fear captured his imagination. These were men who moved quietly but decisively, men whose actions shaped the neighborhood without ever needing to announce themselves. Massino observed how they balanced authority with discretion, how they navigated rivalries, and how they cultivated loyalty. In these observations, he began to see patterns, behaviors that led to respect, strategies that ensured survival, and the subtle art of influence. The lessons were not theoretical, they were lived experiences, etched into the mind of a boy growing into awareness. Adolescence brought a sharper clarity to these observations. As Massino entered his teenage years, the boundaries between childhood games and adult responsibilities blurred. He began to take on small roles in the neighborhood economy, running errands, delivering messages, and observing interactions with a calculating eye. Every encounter became a learning opportunity. A neighbor's praise revealed the value of service, a dispute showed the importance of timing, and a moment of fear highlighted the consequences of misjudgment. Massino's early experiences cultivated an ability to assess risk, measure loyalty, and anticipate outcomes, skills that would later allow him to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime with remarkable precision. Throughout these formative years, Massino displayed a quiet intelligence and an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior. While other boys might have sought immediate gratification, he measured his actions, weighing the potential costs and benefits. He learned that patience often yielded greater rewards than impulsivity, that observation could reveal more than action, and that survival often depended on discretion as much as courage. These lessons, absorbed in the subtle rhythms of family, neighborhood, and community, laid the groundwork for a mind capable of both strategic thinking and cautious execution. The duality of his upbringing, anchored in family and tradition, yet shaped by the undercurrents of risk and ambition, was a defining feature of Massino's early life. It taught him that power could be exercised quietly, that respect could be cultivated without overt violence, and that survival often required choices that were morally complex. Even as a child, he understood that the world was not simply black and white but a landscape of shadows and subtle signals, where the ability to interpret nuance could mean the difference between opportunity and disaster. By the time Massino was approaching adulthood, these early lessons had crystallized into a set of guiding principles: observe carefully, act deliberately, and always be mindful of the consequences. He understood the importance of alliances, the weight of reputation, and the fragility of trust. The neighborhood that had once seemed ordinary was now a matrix of social intelligence, teaching him the art of strategy long before he would ever formally enter the world of organized crime. It was here, in the quiet streets of Brooklyn, in the warmth of family dinners, and in the shadows of community rivalries, that the foundation of Joe Massino's life was built, a foundation of patience, intelligence, and quiet ambition, prepared to carry him toward extraordinary heights while always remaining aware of the ever-present dangers that lay in wait. As Joe Massino moved from adolescence into his late teenage years, the streets of Brooklyn had become more than just a backdrop for daily life. They were a living, breathing entity, teaching lessons in opportunity, risk, and human nature. By now, Massino's sharp observations had matured into an acute understanding of how people behaved under pressure, how alliances formed and dissolved, and how power could be wielded quietly or violently depending on circumstance. The transition from boyhood to young adulthood was gradual, marked not by dramatic events but by a series of small, cumulative experiences that would shape his character and decisions for years to come. It was during this time that he began to encounter crime not as a distant shadow, but as a tangible force, woven into the fabric of the neighborhoods he navigated every day. The first brushes with criminal activity were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A stolen bicycle here, a minor act of shoplifting there, small transgressions that seemed inconsequential to the untrained eye but were in fact lessons in testing boundaries and understanding consequences. Massino approached these early misdeeds with caution, learning the delicate balance between risk and reward. Unlike some of his peers, who acted impulsively and faced the swift repercussions of their choices, he observed carefully, noting which behaviors drew attention, which were punished, and which went unnoticed. Every minor encounter with authority, whether a sharp word from a shopkeeper or the glare of a passing policeman, became a study in cause and effect, reinforcing the importance of discretion and patience. Beyond petty theft, Massino began to witness the workings of more organized, subtle forms of criminal enterprise. Neighborhood figures who operated small gambling rings, loan sharking schemes, or unlicensed businesses became both models and cautionary tales. He watched how these men navigated the community, balancing the maintenance of respect and loyalty with the necessity of secrecy. These lessons were not taught in schools or formal settings, they were absorbed silently, through careful attention to patterns of behavior, the reactions of others, and the consequences of misjudgments. Massino developed an early understanding of strategy, learning that power was not simply taken, it was earned, managed, and protected with constant vigilance. As he grew older, his involvement became slightly more active, though always measured. He began taking on small tasks for local operators, running errands, delivering messages, and performing minor favors that required discretion and trustworthiness. Each task, no matter how seemingly trivial, carried weight. A misstep could result in embarrassment, loss of trust, or even danger. Through these early roles, Massino learned the importance of reliability, subtlety, and the quiet accumulation of reputation. It was not flashy work, but it laid the foundation for skills that would become crucial in his later life: observation, loyalty, timing, and understanding the hidden motives that often drove people's actions. One of the most important lessons Massino absorbed during this period was the duality of human behavior. He saw friends and neighbors behave differently in public than they did in private, learned that fear often disguised itself as respect, and discovered that appearances could be deceiving. A man who seemed amiable and trustworthy could harbor ambition or resentment beneath a calm exterior, while someone who appeared rough or intimidating might be guided by principle or personal loyalty. These realizations reinforced Massino's emerging philosophy: always pay attention, always analyze, and never take anything at face value. In a world where loyalty could be fleeting and alliances could shift in an instant, such understanding was invaluable. Massino's first encounters with more serious criminal figures also introduced him to the social hierarchy of the underworld. He observed how older, experienced men exercised control, not only through force but through subtle influence, reputation, and strategic thinking. He noted how power was often maintained quietly, through observation and calculation rather than outright confrontation. These early observations fostered a sense of patience and timing that would later define his leadership style. He learned that survival, and eventual dominance, depended on knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to conceal one's intentions behind a calm exterior. Another aspect of these formative years was the subtle interplay of fear and respect. Massino noticed that those who commanded respect did not rely solely on violence. They cultivated a presence, an aura that suggested competence, intelligence, and decisiveness. Fear was a tool, but it was most effective when balanced with loyalty and the perception of fairness. He observed that those who were reckless or impulsive often faltered quickly, while those who moved with deliberation gained influence and avoided unnecessary conflict. In this way, Massino's early experiences with crime were less about committing acts of violence and more about understanding the human dynamics that governed interactions, influence, and survival. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Massino had begun to establish a small reputation in his neighborhood. He was known for his discretion, reliability, and ability to handle delicate tasks without drawing unwanted attention. This reputation, earned quietly over years of observation and measured action, attracted the notice of more prominent figures within the local criminal networks. Massino's calm, analytical approach set him apart from more impulsive peers, and those who observed him recognized a latent intelligence and strategic potential. These early interactions were critical, for they provided not only practical experience but also access to mentorship, advice, and exposure to the inner workings of organized operations. It was also during this period that Massino began to understand the long-term consequences of loyalty and betrayal. In a world governed by informal codes, trust was both precious and fragile. Observing friends and associates who faltered under pressure, he learned to evaluate character, measure commitment, and anticipate the likelihood of treachery. These lessons were reinforced by the occasional harsh realities of street justice, disputes that escalated to violence, debts unpaid, and reputations destroyed. Each incident was a case study, a lesson in human nature that sharpened his judgment and reinforced the importance of careful deliberation. Alongside these lessons in crime and strategy, Massino's early life was shaped by a developing sense of ambition. He was not content with mere participation. He observed, calculated, and envisioned a path to influence that extended beyond minor roles. Unlike many peers who were swept along by circumstance, Massino began to see himself as an architect of his own future. He understood that intelligence, patience, and the careful cultivation of reputation could elevate him above the ordinary, and he approached each opportunity with a sense of purpose and planning. Even at a young age, he recognized the value of thinking several steps ahead, anticipating obstacles, and preparing contingencies, a mindset that would later define his approach as a mafia boss. Yet for all the ambition and careful calculation, Massino remained grounded in the realities of his environment. Brooklyn was unforgiving, and mistakes could carry devastating consequences. He learned to respect the balance between risk and reward, to measure each action against its potential outcomes, and to recognize the subtle signs of danger that others might overlook. The combination of observation, experience, and calculated risk-taking became the foundation for a life defined by strategy, foresight, and the quiet accumulation of power. It was here, in these formative encounters with crime, that Massino began to cultivate the skills and instincts that would ultimately allow him to survive, and thrive, in a world where few did. By the time Massino reached the threshold of adulthood, he had transformed from a curious, observant boy into a young man whose understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and the dynamics of power was already remarkable. The streets of Brooklyn had been his teacher, offering lessons in discretion, patience, and strategy, and preparing him for the more complex challenges that awaited. These early encounters with crime were less about glory or notoriety and more about learning, observing, and adapting, lessons that would serve as the bedrock of his future as a leader who understood the delicate balance between ambition, survival, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. By the time Joe Massino reached his early 20s, the lessons he had absorbed from Brooklyn streets and the subtle dynamics of human behavior were beginning to coalesce into a set of skills that would define the rest of his life. The environment he had grown up in, where respect was earned quietly and the consequences of mistakes could be severe, had prepared him for a more formal introduction into the world of organized crime. The Bonanno family, one of New York's notorious five families, operated with an almost invisible structure, maintaining a delicate balance between fear, loyalty, and secrecy. For a young man like Massino, this was both an opportunity and a challenge, a chance to step into a structured hierarchy where patience, intelligence, and discretion were as valuable as brute strength. Massino's entry into the Bonanno family was gradual, a process of observation and proving oneself that mirrored his earlier experiences on the streets. It was not marked by sudden initiation or dramatic ceremonies, but by careful assessment and repeated demonstration of reliability. He undertook small tasks at first, assignments that allowed him to show discretion, judgment, and loyalty without drawing unnecessary attention. These early responsibilities, though modest in scope, were critical in establishing his reputation among the family's inner circle. His ability to handle them quietly and efficiently earned the notice of mentors who would later guide his rise, introducing him to the more formal codes, rituals, and expectations that governed mafia life. The initiation into the family was not merely a ceremonial act, it was a symbolic passage that underscored loyalty, secrecy, and the weight of tradition. Massino observed the significance of these rituals, understanding that they represented more than a personal commitment. They were a public acknowledgement of allegiance, a covenant binding him to a complex web of obligations and expectations. The process reinforced the lessons he had already internalized, the importance of observation, patience, and understanding the subtle cues that indicated trustworthiness, ambition, or potential betrayal. Each moment in the initiation process was carefully calculated, revealing to Massino the delicate interplay between individual ambition and collective loyalty that would shape his strategies in the years to come. Once fully accepted, Massino began to navigate the structured world of the Bonanno family with a careful blend of caution and ambition. He was assigned to supervise minor operations, manage communications, and act as a trusted intermediary in sensitive matters. These tasks were not glamorous, but they offered invaluable insight into the inner workings of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city. Massino observed how authority was exercised, how decisions were made, and how influence could be extended without overt displays of power. In this environment, he learned the importance of discretion and the subtle art of persuasion, a skill that would later allow him to maneuver through rivalries and maintain his position even in moments of extreme tension. The mentorship Massino received during this period was instrumental in shaping his understanding of leadership and strategy. Older, more experienced members of the family taught him the nuances of negotiation, the significance of timing, and the ways in which patience could be more powerful than immediate action. They demonstrated the value of cultivating relationships, managing rivalries, and maintaining a low profile while quietly consolidating influence. For Massino, these lessons were a natural extension of what he had learned on the streets: observation, calculation, and the importance of subtlety. The difference now was that the stakes were exponentially higher, and mistakes carried consequences that could affect not only his future but his very life. One of the most critical aspects of Massino's early years in the Bonanno family was understanding the balance between ambition and loyalty. Ambition was necessary for advancement, yet unchecked ambition could provoke suspicion, envy, and even retaliation. Massino carefully measured his actions, cultivating an image of competence without overtly challenging the authority of those above him. He recognized that influence could be gained quietly, through demonstration of skill and reliability, rather than through displays of aggression or bravado. This approach allowed him to build trust while remaining mindful of the fragile hierarchies and complex interpersonal dynamics that defined mafia life. During this period, Massino also developed a keen understanding of the role of secrecy and discretion. He observed how information could be as powerful as weapons, how carefully managed knowledge could protect, elevate, or endanger an individual. The ability to remain invisible while exerting influence became a hallmark of his approach, setting him apart from peers who were more impulsive or conspicuous. These early experiences emphasized that survival and advancement depended not on overt displays of power, but on subtle, strategic manipulation of circumstances and careful management of relationships. Massino's rise within the family was not merely about operational competence, it was also about perception. He understood that others' confidence in his abilities could be as critical as the abilities themselves. By remaining calm, reliable, and observant, he projected an aura of control that encouraged loyalty and deterred challenges. This ability to inspire trust and command respect without overt threats or displays of violence would later define his leadership style, allowing him to navigate one of the most dangerous and competitive criminal landscapes in New York with remarkable skill. Even as he gained responsibility within the Bonanno family, Massino never lost sight of the lessons from his early life. Observation remained his most powerful tool. He noted the subtle interactions between members, the ways in which alliances shifted, and the signals that indicated potential danger. He studied patterns of behavior, learned to anticipate moves before they were made, and cultivated an understanding of human psychology that would allow him to manipulate situations to his advantage. Each assignment, each interaction, and each decision reinforced these skills, providing the foundation for the strategic thinking that would later make him one of the most formidable figures in the organization. Massino's early years with the family were also marked by the cultivation of loyalty. He understood that alliances within the mafia were fragile and often tested under pressure. By demonstrating reliability, discretion, and intelligence, he earned the confidence of both peers and mentors. This trust was not given lightly, it was earned through consistent performance and careful navigation of complex social dynamics. The ability to maintain loyalty, even under challenging circumstances, became a defining characteristic of Massino's career, allowing him to consolidate influence while minimizing risk. The interplay between mentorship, observation, and practical experience during these formative years was critical. Massino learned to integrate the lessons of his childhood, discretion, patience, and careful assessment of human behavior, with the structured, hierarchical world of the Bonanno family. He began to see the possibilities for advancement, understanding that success in this environment required both intelligence and emotional control. The quiet streets of Brooklyn, which had once been his classroom, now served as a backdrop for more formal lessons in strategy, power, and survival. By the time Massino was fully established within the Bonanno family, he had developed a comprehensive understanding of both operational management and human dynamics. His early roles allowed him to observe the delicate balance of influence, power, and loyalty that governed mafia life. The combination of street-honed instincts, disciplined observation, and formal mentorship prepared him for the more significant challenges that lay ahead. These experiences laid the groundwork for his eventual rise to capo and, later, boss, positions that would demand not only tactical skill but also extraordinary psychological insight. Massino's early years in the Bonanno family highlight the intersection of patience, strategy, and ambition. He moved deliberately, building trust and reputation quietly, understanding that power in this world was rarely seized recklessly. By the time he began to assume greater responsibilities, he had cultivated the qualities that would later allow him to navigate rivalries, manage operations, and maintain his position in one of the most perilous and competitive criminal organizations in New York. The lessons learned during this period, discretion, observation, patience, and strategic loyalty, would serve as the foundation for a life marked by calculated ascent, careful management of risk, and a remarkable ability to survive where many others had fallen. As Joe Massino moved further into his 20s, the foundations he had built during his early years within the Bonanno family began to translate into tangible advancement. His careful observation, patience, and quiet reliability were now complemented by a growing sense of ambition and an intuitive understanding of power. Unlike many who rushed toward prominence with reckless energy, Massino measured each step, assessing not only the immediate consequences but also the long-term implications of his decisions. This measured approach distinguished him from his peers, positioning him as a rising figure whose influence was felt subtly but steadily, like an undercurrent beneath the visible surface of the organization. Massino's early assignments had trained him in operational competence, but it was his ability to navigate the complex web of relationships within the family that truly set him apart. He recognized that advancement required more than completing tasks, it demanded strategic cultivation of trust, the careful negotiation of alliances, and an almost instinctive sense of timing. In the shadows of Brooklyn's dimly lit backrooms, he observed senior members as they conducted business, noting how respect was commanded, how loyalty was tested, and how disputes were resolved without exposing the organization to unnecessary risk. Each interaction offered lessons not only in leadership but also in subtle forms of influence, revealing the intricate balance between authority, persuasion, and intimidation. By the mid-1960s, Massino's growing competence had earned him the title of capo, a rank that signified both trust and responsibility within the Bonanno hierarchy. As a capo, he was charged with overseeing a crew of soldiers and associates, managing their activities, and ensuring that the family's operations ran smoothly. This role required not only organizational skill but also a keen sense of human nature. Massino's ability to assess character, predict behavior, and manage loyalty became central to his effectiveness. He understood that a crew could succeed or fail based on subtle dynamics of trust and influence, and he approached this responsibility with the same patience and calculation that had characterized his rise. The operations under his supervision were diverse, ranging from loan sharking and gambling to more intricate schemes that required discretion and strategic foresight. Each venture was not merely an opportunity for financial gain but a test of leadership. Massino approached these enterprises with meticulous care, ensuring that his crew remained disciplined, that operations remained concealed from law enforcement, and that profits were managed efficiently. His success was not always visible to outsiders, it was measured in the smooth execution of plans, the avoidance of unnecessary conflict, and the quiet maintenance of authority. Yet within the family, his reputation for reliability and competence grew steadily, laying the groundwork for future influence. Massino's rise was also facilitated by his growing mastery of interpersonal strategy. He recognized that loyalty could be cultivated and tested, that alliances were fragile, and that perception often mattered as much as action. By presenting himself as calm, composed, and judicious, he inspired confidence in both his peers and subordinates. His decisions were deliberate, never impulsive, and he maintained a careful balance between authority and approachability. This duality allowed him to consolidate influence without attracting unnecessary attention, positioning himself as a leader whose judgment could be trusted even in the most delicate of situations. A critical component of Massino's ascent was his understanding of the subtle interplay between power and discretion. He observed that those who moved too aggressively often drew the scrutiny of rivals or law enforcement, while those who concealed their ambitions could advance steadily with minimal resistance. Massino's approach combined operational skill with psychological insight. He understood that influence could be exerted quietly, through strategic decisions, careful guidance of subordinates, and cultivation of trust. This methodical style allowed him to build a reputation for competence without creating unnecessary enemies, a crucial factor in the volatile world of organized crime. Even as he gained prominence, Massino remained attentive to the lessons of loyalty and betrayal that had shaped his early experiences. He observed how small missteps could lead to erosion of trust, how mismanaged relationships could destabilize entire operations, and how alliances required constant attention and nurturing. By remaining vigilant, he ensured that potential threats were anticipated and neutralized quietly, maintaining cohesion within his crew and preserving his own position. This foresight and attentiveness became defining characteristics of his leadership style, distinguishing him from others who relied on intimidation alone. Massino's rise was also marked by a growing awareness of the broader organizational and social context. He observed rivalries within the Bonanno family and between other 5 families, noting how disputes over territory, influence, and resources could escalate quickly if mismanaged. His strategy was to remain patient, to avoid unnecessary confrontation, and to exploit opportunities that emerged naturally from the shifting landscape of alliances and conflicts. In doing so, he cultivated both power and credibility, demonstrating that success in organized crime required not only operational skill but also strategic insight and emotional intelligence. The responsibilities of leadership also demanded careful management of resources, both human and financial. Massino understood that maintaining authority required consistent demonstration of competence and fairness. He ensured that his crew's activities were profitable and well-coordinated, that disputes were resolved discreetly, and that loyalty was rewarded appropriately. This combination of operational skill, psychological insight, and strategic foresight allowed him to maintain control over his domain while gradually expanding his influence within the family. His methodical approach contrasted sharply with the impulsive, short-sighted actions of others, reinforcing his reputation as a measured and reliable leader. As his prominence grew, Massino began to recognize the importance of perception and narrative. Within the criminal world, stories of competence, reliability, and strategic thinking carried significant weight. He cultivated an image of calm authority, projecting confidence and control while avoiding unnecessary attention. This careful management of perception extended to his interactions with both allies and rivals. By remaining discreet and deliberate, Massino was able to consolidate power without provoking unnecessary conflict, laying the groundwork for future opportunities and safeguarding his position within a volatile hierarchy. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Massino's reputation had solidified. He was seen as a leader whose judgment could be trusted, whose decisions were measured, and whose influence was quietly pervasive. He had demonstrated an ability to manage operations effectively, cultivate loyalty, and navigate complex social dynamics. More importantly, he had learned to balance ambition with discretion, understanding that survival and advancement required careful timing, patience, and strategic foresight. These qualities distinguished him from his peers and positioned him for the eventual assumption of even greater responsibility within the Bonanno family. Massino's ascent illustrates the intersection of skill, strategy, and human understanding. It was not achieved through flamboyance or overt aggression, but through careful observation, deliberate action, and the cultivation of trust. He recognized that influence in the criminal world was rarely seized through force alone. It required the subtle management of relationships, the ability to anticipate the behavior of others, and the patience to act at precisely the right moment. This methodical approach allowed Massino to rise steadily, gaining both authority and respect while minimizing risk and avoiding unnecessary attention. Throughout this period, the lessons of his early life, observation, discretion, patience, and strategic foresight, remained central to his success. Massino combined these qualities with operational skill and psychological insight, creating a foundation that would support his eventual rise to the highest levels of the Bonanno family. His journey during this phase of life demonstrates that advancement in the underworld depended as much on intellect, judgment, and emotional intelligence as it did on courage or ambition. By the time he had fully established himself as a capable and trusted leader, Massino had already developed the traits that would allow him to navigate the complex and dangerous world of organized crime with remarkable skill and longevity. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Bonanno family was navigating a turbulent period in its history. Years of internal conflict, shifting alliances, and external pressures from rival families had left the organization in a state of flux. For Joe Massino, these upheavals presented both a challenge and an opportunity. He had spent years cultivating patience, observation, and strategic skill, and now the complex dynamics within the family offered the perfect environment for him to exercise his talents. The chaos was not a threat to be avoided, but a terrain to be mapped, studied, and ultimately controlled. The family had endured decades of internal strife, with factions competing for influence and authority. These rivalries were often subtle, conducted through whispers, coded messages, and carefully managed operations, yet their consequences were tangible and sometimes violent. Massino understood that any misstep could provoke retaliation, erode trust, or destabilize operations. At the same time, he recognized that the turmoil offered openings for those who were patient, strategic, and disciplined. Unlike more impulsive members who rushed to assert dominance, Massino moved deliberately, observing the shifting allegiances and calculating the best path forward. This period of upheaval was, in many ways, the crucible in which his leadership style was refined, combining operational skill with psychological insight and strategic foresight. One of the key factors that shaped Massino's rise during this period was his ability to navigate internal rivalries without drawing undue attention. He understood that overt aggression or brash action often invited retaliation, while subtle influence and careful alliances could achieve long-term control without unnecessary risk. Massino cultivated relationships quietly, identifying potential allies and understanding the motivations and vulnerabilities of those who might oppose him. By positioning himself as reliable, discreet, and judicious, he gained the confidence of key figures, establishing a network of support that would prove invaluable as he began to assume greater authority within the family. The turbulent environment also required Massino to manage operations with precision. The family's enterprises, ranging from loan sharking and gambling to extortion and legitimate business ventures, were both lucrative and vulnerable. Mismanagement or exposure could have catastrophic consequences, not only for individual members but for the stability of the entire organization. Massino approached these operations with a disciplined, methodical mindset, ensuring that every detail was accounted for and that potential risks were mitigated. This operational competence, combined with his strategic acumen, reinforced his reputation as a leader capable of navigating complexity with calm authority. At the same time, Massino recognized the importance of perception in consolidating power. In a family marked by internal conflict, the appearance of control was as important as control itself. By projecting calm, measured authority, he reassured allies, deterred potential rivals, and created a sense of stability in an otherwise volatile environment. His ability to maintain composure, even as rival factions maneuvered and tension simmered, distinguished him from those who allowed emotion or impatience to dictate their actions. This skillful management of perception, combined with careful observation and strategic decision-making, allowed Massino to consolidate influence without provoking unnecessary confrontation. During this period, Massino also honed his skill in negotiation and conflict resolution. Internal disputes, whether over territory, profit distribution, or personal grievances, were inevitable in a family as large and complex as the Banana organization. Massino approached these disputes not with impulsive force, but with careful listening, measured intervention, and strategic guidance. He assessed the motivations of all parties involved, anticipated potential outcomes, and crafted solutions that maintained stability while reinforcing his own authority. By resolving conflicts discreetly and effectively, he strengthened his reputation as a capable and judicious leader, able to navigate the most sensitive and challenging situations with composure. The broader context of interfamily rivalries also shaped Massino's approach. The five families of New York were engaged in constant negotiation, competition, and occasional confrontation over territory, operations, and influence. Missteps could lead to violent retaliation, loss of territory, or law enforcement attention. Massino understood that survival required both vigilance and strategic foresight. He monitored rival families, identified potential threats, and developed contingency plans to protect the family's interests. This awareness of the external landscape complemented his internal management skills, allowing him to operate effectively at both tactical and strategic levels. Massino's ability to navigate the Bonanno family's turmoil was also rooted in his understanding of loyalty and trust. In a period of instability, alliances were constantly tested, and loyalty could be fleeting. Massino cultivated loyalty through consistent behavior, discretion, and the careful management of relationships. He recognized that those who felt valued and respected were less likely to betray him, while those who perceived weakness or inconsistency could become liabilities. By balancing support and subtle deterrence, he maintained cohesion within his crew and the broader organization, reinforcing both stability and his own influence. This period also demanded an acute awareness of timing. Massino recognized that opportunities for advancement or consolidation of power often emerged slowly and subtly. He waited for the right moments to act, carefully assessing risks and potential outcomes before making decisions. This patience, cultivated from years of observation and experience, allowed him to capitalize on openings created by rival missteps or shifts in loyalty. By moving deliberately and strategically, Massino was able to strengthen his position without drawing undue attention or provoking unnecessary conflict. Massino's handling of the Bonanno family's internal turbulence demonstrates the integration of operational competence, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. He combined careful management of day-to-day operations with subtle influence over interpersonal dynamics, creating an environment in which loyalty and stability were reinforced. At the same time, he maintained awareness of external threats, rivalries, and opportunities, positioning himself as a central figure capable of guiding the family through complex challenges. This multifaceted approach to leadership distinguished him from contemporaries who relied primarily on intimidation, impulsive action, or public displays of power. Even in the midst of turmoil, Massino's long-term vision remained clear. He understood that true authority required more than immediate control, it required the cultivation of trust, the careful management of perception, and the ability to navigate both internal and external complexities. By combining operational skill with strategic patience and psychological insight, he was able to consolidate influence steadily, laying the groundwork for eventual leadership at the highest levels of the Bonanno family. Through this period of internal upheaval and external pressure, Massino demonstrated the qualities that would define his career: patience, strategic thinking, careful observation, and the ability to manage both people and operations with subtlety and intelligence. The challenges of the family's turbulent environment became opportunities for growth, allowing him to refine his skills in leadership, negotiation, and the management of risk. By the end of this period, Massino was not merely a rising figure within the Bonanno family, he was a strategist, a diplomat, and a leader whose calm, measured approach allowed him to navigate one of the most volatile criminal landscapes in New York with remarkable effectiveness. In these years, Massino's mastery of subtle influence, strategic patience, and operational oversight was fully evident. He had learned to turn the family's chaos into a terrain he could control, using careful observation, calculated interventions, and psychological insight to maintain stability and consolidate authority. The turbulence that had threatened others became, for Massino, a proving ground, a test of skill, judgment, and foresight that he navigated with remarkable success. It was through this process that he positioned himself for the eventual assumption of complete leadership, demonstrating that in the world of organized crime, the quiet, deliberate strategist often outlasted the loudest and most impulsive of competitors. By the mid-1990s, Joe Massino had carefully positioned himself at the center of the Bonanno family, rising steadily through a combination of patience, strategy, and quiet influence. Years of navigating rivalries, consolidating loyalty, and managing complex operations had prepared him for the highest levels of leadership. When the opportunity finally presented itself for Massino to assume the role of boss, he did so not with fanfare or ostentation, but with a calm decisiveness that reflected the years of preparation behind him. Unlike the flamboyant figures often associated with organized crime, Massino's approach was understated, methodical, and calculated, projecting authority through competence and composure rather than theatrics. Assuming the helm of the Bonanno family brought both prestige and unprecedented responsibility. Massino now oversaw a vast network of operations, including loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and legitimate businesses that were subtly intertwined with criminal ventures. Each decision carried weight, with the potential to impact not only profits but the loyalty and safety of his associates. At the same time, the external pressures from rival families and law enforcement were relentless, requiring constant vigilance and strategic foresight. Massino's leadership style, disciplined, careful, and psychologically astute, allowed him to navigate these pressures while maintaining the stability and cohesion of the family. One of the hallmarks of Massino's tenure as boss was his ability to maintain control through subtle influence rather than overt intimidation. He understood that true authority relied not on fear alone, but on the perception of competence, fairness, and foresight. Associates and rivals alike recognized that Massino's decisions were measured, deliberate, and guided by strategic calculation. This perception reinforced his authority, creating an environment in which loyalty was maintained, disputes were minimized, and operations continued smoothly. His quiet demeanor and methodical approach were deceptively powerful, enabling him to exercise control without drawing unnecessary attention or provoking conflict. Internal stability became a central focus of Massino's leadership. The Bonanno family had a history of factionalism and disputes, and one of his earliest challenges as boss was ensuring that these tensions did not escalate into violence or disruption. Massino approached this task with the same patience and strategic insight that had defined his rise. He listened to grievances, assessed motivations, and intervened at precisely the right moment to guide outcomes in the family's favor. By resolving disputes discreetly and fairly, he strengthened his position while reinforcing trust and loyalty among his subordinates. This careful management of relationships was critical in maintaining the family's cohesion during a period of both internal and external pressure. Massino's leadership was also characterized by a keen understanding of risk management. He recognized that the Bonanno family's operations were subject to constant scrutiny from law enforcement, rival families, and potential informants. Decisions were rarely made impulsively, each action was weighed against its potential consequences, and contingency plans were developed to mitigate exposure. Massino's foresight allowed him to anticipate challenges, adapt to changing circumstances, and respond to threats with precision. This approach not only protected the family's operations but also reinforced his reputation as a prudent and capable leader. The management of external relations was equally critical. Massino understood that alliances and rivalries with other families required careful negotiation and subtle influence. He maintained open channels of communication, cultivated relationships with key figures, and navigated disputes with a combination of diplomacy and strategic calculation. By balancing firmness with discretion, Massino was able to assert the Bonanno family's authority while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. His ability to manage these complex interactions reflected both his operational acumen and his psychological insight, allowing him to maintain influence across the broader organized crime landscape of New York. Operational efficiency remained a cornerstone of Massino's leadership. He oversaw a wide range of criminal and legitimate enterprises, ensuring that each was managed effectively, discreetly, and profitably. Subordinates were held accountable, and performance was monitored closely, but discipline was tempered with fairness and strategic reward. Massino understood that loyalty was reinforced not through fear alone, but through the consistent demonstration of competence, reliability, and equitable treatment. This balance of enforcement and encouragement created a motivated, disciplined, and dependable network of associates, capable of executing complex operations under his guidance. A defining feature of Massino's leadership was his psychological insight. He understood that human behavior could be anticipated, influenced, and managed through subtle cues, communication, and perception. He applied these insights to both internal and external interactions, shaping outcomes without resorting to overt force or intimidation. By projecting calm authority, carefully managing information, and selectively rewarding loyalty, Massino created an environment in which others acted in accordance with his strategic vision. His leadership was thus both direct and indirect, exerting influence through presence, perception, and subtle manipulation rather than through visible displays of power. Massino's rise to boss also demonstrated his strategic patience. Unlike impulsive figures who seized power through dramatic actions, Massino waited for the right moment to assert his authority. He allowed rivalries to play out, assessed the landscape, and positioned himself as a stabilizing force. By the time he assumed control, he had cultivated both the operational skill and the psychological insight necessary to lead effectively. His measured approach minimized risk, maximized loyalty, and ensured that his ascent did not provoke unnecessary conflict or destabilize the family's operations. The perception of Massino as a calm, judicious leader extended beyond his immediate associates. Even rival factions recognized his strategic acumen and careful management of relationships. By maintaining an image of reasoned authority and composed decisiveness, he reinforced the family's standing within the broader network of organized crime. This perception, carefully cultivated over years of observation, patience, and strategic action, allowed Massino to exercise influence and maintain control without resorting to displays of violence or coercion that might draw law enforcement attention or provoke retaliation. Massino's tenure as boss also highlighted his ability to integrate long-term planning with immediate operational needs. While day-to-day operations required attention and discipline, Massino simultaneously considered broader strategic objectives, the consolidation of influence, the maintenance of stability, and the positioning of the family for future opportunities. This dual focus, balancing immediate concerns with long-term vision, distinguished him from leaders who prioritized short-term gains at the expense of sustainability. Massino's approach ensured that the family not only survived periods of turbulence but also remained positioned for continued influence and profitability. Even as he exercised authority over the family's operations, Massino remained aware of the broader stakes. Leadership in the Bonanno family was not merely a matter of personal ambition, it was a responsibility to a network of associates, a legacy of loyalty, and a careful navigation of law enforcement scrutiny. Massino approached this responsibility with the seriousness it demanded, applying the lessons of observation, discretion, and strategic foresight that had guided him throughout his career. Each decision was measured, each action deliberate, and each interaction guided by a careful consideration of both immediate and long-term consequences. Ultimately, Massino's emergence as the boss of the Bonanno family was the culmination of decades of preparation, observation, and strategic thinking. His leadership reflected a deep understanding of human behavior, a mastery of operational management, and a commitment to discretion and patience. Unlike leaders defined by bravado or spectacle, Massino's authority was built on competence, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. In assuming the helm of the Bonanno family, he demonstrated that true power in organized crime was often exercised quietly, deliberately, and with an awareness of the complex interplay between loyalty, influence, and risk. Massino's ascent to boss marked not only a personal achievement but also a turning point for the Bonanno family. Under his measured leadership, the organization maintained stability, navigated internal and external pressures, and reinforced its influence within the broader criminal landscape. Massino's approach, calm, calculated, and psychologically sophisticated, set the tone for the family's operations and relationships, demonstrating that the exercise of power required far more than strength or intimidation. It demanded intelligence, patience, and the subtle mastery of human behavior, qualities that Massino had cultivated from the streets of Brooklyn to the very top of one of New York's most formidable crime families. By the time Joe Massino had assumed leadership of the Bonanno family, he understood that power alone was not enough to ensure survival or success. The criminal underworld was a landscape defined by unpredictability, rivalry, and constant scrutiny, and a leader's longevity depended as much on intellect and strategy as it did on operational strength or loyalty from subordinates. Massino's rise to the top had been the result of decades of observation, careful decision-making, and patient cultivation of alliances, but maintaining his position required a mastery of strategy that went far beyond the management of day-to-day operations. It required foresight, adaptability, and an almost instinctive understanding of human behavior. He recognized early on that in organized crime, the difference between survival and downfall was often a matter of timing, perception, and subtle calculation. Massino's approach to leadership was distinguished by its focus on long-term outcomes. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who acted impulsively or sought immediate gratification, he prioritized patience and foresight. Every decision, from the allocation of resources to the management of personnel, was evaluated not just for immediate benefit but for its potential long-term consequences. He carefully considered how each action might influence relationships within the family, affect alliances with other organizations, or attract the attention of law enforcement. This strategic mindset allowed him to maintain stability and authority even in the face of unpredictable challenges, demonstrating a level of prudence and calculation that set him apart in the often chaotic world of organized crime. Central to Massino's strategy was the cultivation of loyalty and trust. He understood that the strength of his leadership depended on the allegiance of his subordinates and the cohesion of his organization. Rather than relying solely on fear or intimidation, he combined respect with measured enforcement, rewarding competence and reliability while subtly discouraging disloyalty. Small gestures, whether in the form of recognition, support, or strategic assignments, reinforced loyalty and demonstrated that Massino valued both skill and discretion. At the same time, potential threats were identified and neutralized quietly, often before they fully emerged, preserving stability without provoking unnecessary conflict. This careful balancing act between reward and deterrence became a defining feature of his leadership style. Strategic foresight also played a critical role in Massino's management of operational risks. He was acutely aware that law enforcement, rival factions, and internal informants were ever-present threats. Each operation required meticulous planning, attention to detail, and contingency strategies in case of exposure or failure. Massino's ability to anticipate potential pitfalls and develop preventive measures ensured that his ventures remained profitable while minimizing risk. He recognized that operational success was inseparable from strategic thinking and that even the most routine activities could carry significant consequences if not managed with foresight. Massino's understanding of human psychology further enhanced his strategic capabilities. He could read subtle cues, interpret motives, and anticipate reactions, allowing him to guide behavior without overt coercion. This skill was especially valuable in resolving conflicts, negotiating alliances, and maintaining discipline within his organization. By understanding the fears, ambitions, and desires of those around him, Massino could influence decisions, shape perceptions, and orchestrate outcomes that aligned with his strategic objectives. His mastery of psychological insight allowed him to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with a deftness that few rivals could match, reinforcing both his authority and the cohesion of the Bonanno family. One of the most important aspects of Massino's strategic approach was his management of information. He understood that knowledge was a form of power, and that controlling who knew what, and when, was critical to maintaining influence. Sensitive information was carefully disseminated, with attention to the motivations and reliability of each recipient. This approach allowed Massino to manage internal loyalty, anticipate challenges, and maintain an advantage over rivals both within and outside the family. By exercising discretion and maintaining control over information, he reinforced the perception of competence and authority, enhancing both operational effectiveness and personal influence. Massino's strategies were also evident in his approach to conflict with rival factions. He recognized that direct confrontation was often costly and risky, and that indirect, strategic measures could achieve superior results. Negotiation, alliance building, and subtle manipulation were tools he wielded with precision, allowing him to neutralize threats without provoking open violence. By assessing potential risks and anticipating the moves of rivals, Massino could orchestrate outcomes that reinforced his position while preserving stability within the family. This strategic use of both diplomacy and deterrence exemplified his long-term approach to leadership, highlighting the interplay between foresight, patience, and psychological acuity. Another critical element of Massino's strategy was his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The criminal landscape of New York was dynamic, with shifting alliances, law enforcement pressure, and unpredictable external threats. Massino demonstrated remarkable flexibility, adjusting his tactics to align with emerging realities without compromising his long-term objectives. He combined careful observation with calculated action, ensuring that his decisions were both timely and effective. This adaptability allowed him to maintain stability and authority in an environment where rigidity or impulsiveness often led to failure. Massino's operational oversight was deeply intertwined with his strategic vision. He managed a network of crews, operations, and enterprises with an eye toward both efficiency and long-term growth. Each assignment was evaluated for its contribution to the family's overall stability, profitability, and influence. Subordinates were carefully selected, trained, and monitored, and their performance was both rewarded and disciplined as necessary. By integrating operational management with strategic foresight, Massino ensured that the family's ventures remained productive, cohesive, and resilient in the face of internal and external pressures. Even routine decisions were informed by his long-term perspective. Whether assigning tasks, resolving disputes, or negotiating agreements, Massino considered the broader implications for the family's power structure and his own authority. This strategic mindset extended to every aspect of his leadership, from financial management to interpersonal relationships. By consistently applying foresight, patience, and careful calculation, Massino reinforced both stability and loyalty, creating a network that was resilient, efficient, and aligned with his vision. At its core, Massino's strategic approach combined discipline, observation, and psychological insight. He recognized that the most effective leaders in organized crime were not those who relied solely on force, charisma, or intimidation, but those who could anticipate challenges, manage human behavior, and orchestrate outcomes with precision. His ability to integrate operational competence, long-term planning, and nuanced understanding of human behavior allowed him to maintain control over the Bonanno family while positioning himself for continued influence and survival. Ultimately, Massino's strategic mindset distinguished him from his peers and ensured his longevity in a world where many leaders were quickly eliminated by rivals, law enforcement, or internal betrayal. His careful attention to timing, foresight, and psychological insight allowed him to navigate complex challenges, maintain loyalty, and execute plans with remarkable precision. By combining operational skill with strategic vision, he transformed his leadership into a system that balanced immediate control with long-term objectives, ensuring that his position within the Bonanno family was both secure and enduring. Massino's legacy as a strategic thinker highlights a fundamental truth about organized crime: success and survival are rarely determined by force alone. They are earned through observation, calculation, patience, and the subtle management of relationships and perception. By applying these principles consistently, Massino created an environment in which authority, loyalty, and operational stability were maintained, allowing him to exercise influence with a combination of precision and discretion that few could match. His mastery of strategy ensured that he could not only navigate the volatile world of the mafia but also thrive within it, shaping outcomes in ways that reinforced both his power and the cohesion of the Bonanno family. At the peak of Joe Massino's influence, the Bonanno family had become an organization characterized by both efficiency and quiet authority. By this time, he had fully integrated the lessons of observation, strategic patience, and psychological insight that had guided his rise from the streets of Brooklyn to the highest echelons of power. Life at the top of a mafia family was paradoxical. It carried prestige, wealth, and influence, yet it also brought immense responsibility, constant vigilance, and the ever-present shadow of danger. Massino understood that being a boss was not simply about commanding respect or accumulating wealth. It was about maintaining stability, anticipating threats, and guiding the actions of others with subtle precision. The apex of his power was marked not by flamboyance or ostentation, but by quiet control. Massino's operations spanned loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and the careful integration of legitimate businesses that allowed the family to launder money and expand influence discreetly. Each operation required meticulous oversight, but unlike earlier phases of his career, Massino now had the authority to shape strategy across the organization, allocating resources, delegating responsibilities, and guiding crews with a combination of trust and subtle influence. The network he had built was efficient and disciplined, reflecting years of careful cultivation, observation, and the judicious exercise of authority. While the family's outward operations appeared seamless, Massino understood the delicate balance that underpinned this stability. Maintaining cohesion required managing personalities, alliances, and expectations across multiple crews and factions. Loyalty could not be assumed, it had to be cultivated continuously. Massino's approach combined fairness, psychological insight, and subtle deterrence. By recognizing contributions, addressing grievances discreetly, and rewarding reliability, he reinforced allegiance without creating resentment. At the same time, potential threats or disloyalty were neutralized quietly, often before they became visible challenges. This duality, encouraging loyalty while preempting threats, was central to his enduring control over the family. One of the most striking aspects of life at the top was the constant tension between public perception and private reality. Massino projected calm, measured authority, ensuring that subordinates, allies, and rivals alike perceived him as competent, reliable, and strategically minded. Yet behind this composed exterior, he was continually analyzing, calculating, and adjusting to shifting circumstances. Rival families, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal dynamics demanded that he remain vigilant at all times. Small miscalculations could result in destabilized operations or violent conflict, and Massino's experience taught him that foresight and patience were the only reliable defenses against unforeseen challenges. The psychological complexity of his role as boss cannot be overstated. Massino had to manage fear, respect, and trust simultaneously, understanding that each could be a tool for influence or a source of instability if mismanaged. He cultivated respect through competence, fair decision-making, and measured enforcement, while fear was applied sparingly, only as necessary to maintain discipline. Loyalty was reinforced through recognition, mentorship, and the careful distribution of opportunities, ensuring that subordinates felt both valued and accountable. This intricate management of human behavior allowed Massino to maintain authority without relying on excessive displays of power, demonstrating a subtle mastery of leadership rarely seen even in organized crime. Massino's peak power was also defined by his strategic oversight of operations. He monitored the performance of each crew, ensured adherence to protocols, and maintained control over financial flows with precision. Operational efficiency was crucial, but it was complemented by his long-term planning. Massino considered how each venture, interaction, and decision could affect the family's stability and his own influence over time. This foresight allowed him to anticipate challenges, mitigate risks, and position the organization for continued prosperity. At the apex of his leadership, his authority extended far beyond immediate operations, encompassing both the strategic direction and the subtle orchestration of human behavior within the family. Financial management was another critical aspect of life at the top. Massino oversaw substantial flows of money generated through criminal enterprises, balancing the need for profitability with the necessity of discretion. He understood that mismanagement or exposure could be catastrophic, not only for the organization but also for his personal security. His careful oversight extended to both illicit operations and legitimate businesses, ensuring that funds were allocated efficiently, risks were mitigated, and the family's long-term stability was preserved. The disciplined financial approach reinforced the perception of competence, enhancing both internal loyalty and external credibility. Even in moments of apparent calm, Massino was acutely aware of the fragility of power. Leadership in organized crime was never static, it required constant attention, subtle adjustments, and the anticipation of both internal and external threats. Rival factions, discontented subordinates, and the looming presence of law enforcement all demanded vigilance. Massino's approach was methodical, he observed, assessed, and intervened with precision, maintaining control while avoiding unnecessary exposure. His ability to navigate these pressures quietly yet decisively distinguished him from others who relied primarily on force, bravado, or public displays of authority. Life at the top also involved a constant negotiation of risk and reward. Every decision carried potential consequences, and Massino's experience had taught him to weigh options carefully. He assessed the likelihood of success, the potential for disruption, and the strategic implications of each action. At the pinnacle of his leadership, Massino embodied the paradox of organized crime, a life of immense control and influence lived under constant pressure and scrutiny. His ability to maintain stability, exercise authority, and anticipate threats reflected decades of preparation, observation, and strategic development. The apex of his power was not defined by flamboyant actions or public notoriety, but by the quiet, deliberate mastery of human behavior, operational management, and long-term strategy. In this period, Massino's leadership demonstrated that the most effective bosses were those who could combine discipline, foresight, and psychological insight to navigate a complex and perilous world with both authority and subtlety. Even at the height of his power, Joe Massino was acutely aware that dominance in the underworld was never absolute. Rivalries, both within the Bonanno family and among the other 5 families of New York, were constant and unpredictable. The delicate web of alliances, grudges, and strategic positioning meant that no one, not even a boss with Massino's reputation and skill, could take loyalty for granted. The people closest to him, those who had once been allies or subordinates, could quickly shift into adversaries if incentives changed or opportunities arose. Massino understood that a leader's survival relied as much on foresight and subtle influence as it did on operational control. Awareness of these ever-present threats became a constant undercurrent in his daily life. The internal rivalries within the Bonanno family required particular attention. Factions had emerged over decades, each with its own loyalties, grievances, and ambitions. Some members were cautious and disciplined, focused on profit and operational efficiency, while others were impulsive, easily provoked, or motivated by personal recognition. Massino's task was to maintain cohesion while ensuring that no faction became powerful enough to challenge his authority. He approached this challenge with a combination of diplomacy, psychological insight, and strategic maneuvering. Conflicts were rarely confronted directly, instead, they were anticipated and subtly guided toward resolution, often through quiet interventions or the careful reallocation of responsibilities. One of Massino's most effective strategies in managing rivals was observation. He constantly monitored the behavior, decisions, and interactions of key figures, discerning motives, ambitions, and potential weaknesses. Through careful attention, he could anticipate tensions before they escalated and take preemptive steps to neutralize threats. Whether a disagreement over territory, a dispute about profit distribution, or a personal grievance, Massino's method was to understand the underlying dynamics and address them discreetly, preserving both stability and loyalty. His ability to read people and predict behavior became a critical tool in maintaining authority in a volatile environment. The external pressures from rival families added another layer of complexity. The 5 families of New York operated in an environment where competition was constant, and the consequences of miscalculation could be violent. Massino was aware that rival bosses were always assessing the Bonanno family for weaknesses, seeking opportunities to expand their own influence or undermine his leadership. To navigate this, Massino balanced discretion with strategic communication. He maintained networks of intelligence, cultivated informal alliances, and occasionally deployed subtle deterrents to assert authority without provoking unnecessary conflict. This careful calibration allowed him to safeguard his organization while projecting a controlled image of strength and competence to outsiders. Trust and loyalty within the family were never static, they required constant attention and reinforcement. Massino recognized that the perception of fairness and competence was as important as actual authority. Associates needed to feel valued, understood, and fairly treated, while simultaneously being aware that breaches of loyalty or incompetence would be addressed promptly and subtly. This duality, rewarding loyalty and competence while quietly neutralizing potential threats, was a hallmark of his leadership. By blending reassurance with strategic deterrence, Massino maintained a cohesive network in which each member's role was understood and aligned with the family's broader objectives. Managing rivals also required discretion in communication and information control. Massino understood that knowledge was power, and that carefully managing the flow of information could prevent disputes from escalating and allow him to maintain control. Sensitive discussions were held privately, with careful attention to who was included and what was revealed. By controlling information, he not only managed the perception of events but also positioned himself to influence decisions and outcomes subtly. This approach reduced unnecessary conflict and reinforced his reputation as a leader capable of both intelligence and discretion. The constant presence of law enforcement added a pervasive, silent threat to all interactions. Surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover investigations meant that every move, conversation, or operation had to be conducted with care. Massino incorporated this awareness into his management of rivals. He emphasized indirect intervention and subtle guidance over overt confrontation, reducing exposure and risk. By avoiding public displays of conflict or aggression, he protected both the organization and himself, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of risk management in a high-stakes environment. Another critical factor in handling rivals was timing. Massino had learned that premature action could provoke resistance, while delayed action could allow a rival to gain momentum. He balanced patience with decisiveness, choosing moments to intervene strategically. Whether resolving a disagreement within a crew or addressing the ambitions of a high-ranking member, Massino's timing ensured that his interventions were both effective and minimally disruptive. This sense of timing was cultivated over years of careful observation, street-level experience, and early mentorship, becoming a defining element of his ability to maintain authority. Psychology was at the heart of his strategy. Massino understood that people acted not only out of interest or fear but also in response to perception, expectation, and subtle cues. He leveraged this understanding to guide behavior, manage tensions, and reinforce his authority. Simple gestures, a quiet conversation, a strategic assignment, or selective acknowledgement, could shape loyalty and influence decisions. Conversely, subtle signals of potential consequences for disloyalty maintained discipline without overt confrontation. By aligning perception with his strategic objectives, Massino exerted influence that was both pervasive and discreet, ensuring cohesion and control. Rivalries often manifested in disputes over resources, territory, or influence, and Massino's handling of these situations highlighted his leadership acumen. He approached each conflict analytically, assessing risks, evaluating potential outcomes, and choosing interventions that maximized benefit while minimizing disruption. By guiding decisions subtly and managing expectations, he neutralized threats before they escalated. This approach not only maintained operational stability but also reinforced his image as a calm, competent, and authoritative leader, someone who could resolve disputes effectively without destabilizing the family. Massino also recognized that demonstrating competence and authority in the face of rivalries was essential for long-term stability. By consistently making prudent decisions, maintaining discipline, and projecting calm authority, he established a reputation that discouraged challenges and encouraged compliance. Associates and adversaries alike understood that Massino's leadership was both strategic and effective, reinforcing his position without the need for constant displays of force. This combination of quiet authority and strategic insight became central to his approach to maintaining control over the family and its operations. Throughout this period, Massino's management of rivals required a delicate interplay of subtle influence, strategic foresight, and operational control. He integrated these elements seamlessly, ensuring that every intervention, assignment, or negotiation reinforced both stability and loyalty. By anticipating challenges, guiding behavior, and maintaining a reputation for competence, he was able to navigate the complex web of internal and external rivalries with remarkable effectiveness. The result was a cohesive, disciplined, and strategically aligned organization under his leadership, capable of operating efficiently while minimizing the risks inherent in a volatile criminal environment. Ultimately, the careful management of rivals was not merely about maintaining authority, it was about survival. Massino understood that in a world defined by constant competition, loyalty, and subtle shifts in power, even a slight miscalculation could be fatal. His approach, rooted in observation, patience, psychological insight, and strategic intervention, ensured that he could neutralize threats before they escalated and maintain cohesion and influence at the highest levels. By blending subtle influence with calculated action, Massino demonstrated the unique skill set that allowed him to navigate the treacherous landscape of organized crime while consolidating his power and preserving the stability of the Bonanno family. Even the most calculated and cautious leaders eventually encounter forces beyond their control, and for Joe Massino, that force came in the form of relentless law enforcement pressure. By the early 2000s, the FBI and federal prosecutors had developed a sophisticated understanding of the five families' operations, using wiretaps, undercover agents, and informants to infiltrate organized crime networks. Massino, despite his reputation for discretion and strategic foresight, understood that the stakes had shifted. The methods of surveillance were no longer crude, they were precise, pervasive, and capable of exposing even the most careful leaders. Every conversation, every meeting, every transaction could be observed, recorded, and analyzed. In this environment, the margin for error had narrowed drastically, and survival demanded constant vigilance. Massino's awareness of federal attention was not new. For decades, he had operated with an understanding of the legal risks inherent in organized crime. However, the sophistication of modern investigative techniques represented a new kind of challenge, one that required not only operational caution but also a re-evaluation of strategy. The FBI's ability to exploit internal vulnerabilities, identify potential informants, and apply pressure through plea deals meant that leaders like Massino could no longer rely solely on reputation, discretion, or influence over subordinates. The landscape had evolved, and Massino recognized that adaptability was now as crucial as authority. The first signs of intensified scrutiny often began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Unexplained inquiries, subtle shifts in behavior among associates, and reports of increased surveillance signaled that the federal authorities were closing in. Massino's instinct, honed over decades of observation, allowed him to detect these signs early. He understood that apparent calm could be deceptive and that the absence of overt disruption did not equate to safety. Every piece of information, every subtle anomaly, was analyzed, and strategies were adjusted accordingly. This proactive approach to risk management demonstrated Massino's deep understanding of the interplay between operational activity and external threats, highlighting the strategic patience that had carried him to the top. Wiretaps and undercover operations created an unprecedented level of exposure. Leaders who had previously relied on discretion found themselves vulnerable to unseen observers, their words and actions recorded for future use in court. Massino responded with calculated caution, implementing measures to compartmentalize information, limit unnecessary discussions, and maintain the integrity of his operations. Communications were carefully monitored, meetings were conducted with greater attention to detail, and associates were reminded, subtly but persistently, of the importance of discretion. These measures were not panic-driven, they were deliberate, methodical, and reflective of a leader acutely aware of the evolving threats in his environment. The use of informants was perhaps the most insidious challenge. Massino knew that loyalty could be tested under pressure, and that even long-standing associates might be compelled to cooperate with authorities to protect themselves. The threat was both operational and psychological, as the uncertainty surrounding human behavior created a persistent tension within the organization. Massino's response was multifaceted. He reinforced loyalty through selective rewards, strategic mentoring, and subtle psychological influence, while simultaneously observing for signs of disloyalty or compromise. This careful balance of trust and vigilance allowed him to manage the internal risks posed by potential informants without undermining morale or cohesion. Massino also understood the broader implications of federal scrutiny. Legal exposure extended beyond individual arrests, it threatened the stability of entire operations and could disrupt the family's financial and strategic networks. He approached these challenges with strategic foresight, identifying vulnerabilities, reallocating responsibilities, and adjusting operational practices to mitigate risk. By anticipating the potential consequences of investigation, he was able to maintain organizational stability while minimizing exposure to federal authorities. This level of planning required both operational competence and an acute awareness of legal and procedural dynamics, demonstrating Massino's capacity to integrate multiple domains of expertise in his decision-making. The psychological toll of constant law enforcement pressure was significant. Massino, accustomed to managing threats within the family and navigating rivalries, now faced an external force capable of exploiting even the smallest misstep. The stakes were no longer limited to reputation, loyalty, or operational success, they extended to personal freedom and survival. Yet Massino's years of disciplined observation, strategic thinking, and calculated patience provided him with the tools to navigate this high-stakes environment. Rather than succumbing to fear or impulsive reaction, he adapted his leadership style to the realities of federal surveillance, reinforcing both operational discipline and loyalty among his associates. Communication became a critical focal point under this heightened scrutiny. Massino recognized that casual conversation could be recorded, that meetings could be monitored, and that even seemingly innocuous statements could have severe consequences. He implemented protocols to limit exposure, ensuring that sensitive information was shared only on a need-to-know basis and that operational decisions were insulated from potential leaks. Associates were trained, subtly reminded, and observed for compliance, creating a culture of heightened awareness that minimized the risk of compromise. These measures reflected Massino's understanding of the evolving criminal environment and his capacity to adapt his leadership to meet new challenges. The strategic dimension of Massino's response extended to long-term contingency planning. He considered multiple scenarios, anticipating possible arrests, betrayals, or operational disruptions. By envisioning a range of outcomes, he was able to develop flexible strategies that allowed the family to continue functioning even under pressure. This foresight was complemented by his ability to assess risk at both tactical and strategic levels, ensuring that immediate operational decisions were aligned with long-term objectives. In this way, Massino maintained both stability and control, demonstrating that survival in the modern criminal landscape required a combination of adaptability, foresight, and meticulous planning. Despite the increasing pressure from law enforcement, Massino maintained his composure and authority. His calm demeanor, cultivated over decades of careful observation and disciplined leadership, reassured his associates and deterred potential rivals. By projecting confidence and competence, he reinforced the perception that the family remained strong and stable, even in the face of unprecedented external scrutiny. This ability to maintain psychological control over both subordinates and rivals became a defining feature of his leadership, highlighting the depth of his strategic acumen. Ultimately, the increasing attention from the FBI and federal prosecutors signaled a turning point in Massino's tenure. The sophisticated methods of investigation, the threat of informants, and the evolving legal landscape created pressures that would challenge even the most disciplined and cautious leaders. Massino's response, combining operational discretion, strategic foresight, psychological insight, and meticulous planning, demonstrated his ability to navigate this high-risk environment with skill and composure. Yet even as he maintained control, the inevitability of exposure, coupled with the evolving dynamics of loyalty and risk, foreshadowed decisions and challenges that would shape the final chapters of his career in the criminal underworld. Through this period, Massino's handling of law enforcement pressure highlights the intersection of strategy, foresight, and human psychology. He balanced vigilance with discretion, authority with subtle influence, and operational control with long-term planning. In doing so, he navigated a landscape where the smallest misstep could have catastrophic consequences, maintaining the stability and cohesion of the Bonanno family while preparing for the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead. His ability to adapt to the evolving pressures of federal scrutiny reflects a level of strategic sophistication that few criminal leaders have ever demonstrated, setting the stage for both his survival and the difficult choices that would define the next phase of his life. Despite Joe Massino's careful strategies, disciplined leadership, and meticulous management of both operations and relationships, the unpredictable nature of the criminal underworld meant that even the most loyal allies could become threats. By the early 2000s, signs of betrayal began to surface, subtle at first but increasingly impossible to ignore. Those who had once pledged unwavering loyalty, trusted associates, longtime crew members, and even family friends, were now vulnerable to pressure, coercion, or incentives offered by federal authorities. Massino, a man who had navigated decades of internal rivalries with skill and patience, now faced a different kind of challenge: betrayal from within, from the very people he had relied upon to maintain the strength and cohesion of the Bonanno family. The first indications of internal disloyalty were quiet, almost imperceptible. Associates began exhibiting behaviors that hinted at divided allegiances, missed meetings, vague explanations, reluctance to share critical information, or subtle shifts in demeanor. Massino's keen observational skills, honed over decades, allowed him to detect these changes before they escalated. He understood that in the world he inhabited, even minor lapses in loyalty could be dangerous. Trust, once broken, could lead to operational compromise, exposure to law enforcement, or violent consequences. His response was measured and deliberate, balancing vigilance with the preservation of morale, and always considering the broader strategic implications of each intervention. The presence of federal pressure intensified these risks. The FBI and federal prosecutors had increasingly sophisticated methods of cultivating informants, exploiting vulnerabilities, and applying psychological pressure to induce cooperation. Even the most disciplined and long-standing members of the family were not immune. Massino had to anticipate the ways in which associates might respond to these pressures, evaluating who could be trusted, who was susceptible, and who might be swayed to act against the family's interests. This required not only operational insight but a deep understanding of human behavior, psychology, and motivation, a skill Massino had refined over decades of observation, mentorship, and experience in the streets and the family hierarchy. Betrayal, however, was not merely a theoretical concern, it became a tangible reality as some members of the Bonanno family began to cooperate with authorities. Informants were activated, meetings were monitored, and confidential information began to leak. For Massino, this represented a dual threat: operational compromise and the erosion of trust. Every piece of information that fell into federal hands had the potential to destabilize operations, expose sensitive networks, and undermine his authority. The psychological toll was significant, as the realization that those closest to him could act against him introduced both tension and uncertainty into the family's dynamics. Massino's response to internal betrayal was marked by his characteristic strategic foresight. He understood that direct confrontation could provoke further complications or violence, while inaction could allow disloyalty to spread. Instead, he employed subtle interventions, discreetly gathering intelligence, reinforcing loyalty among reliable associates, and reassigning responsibilities to mitigate risk. By acting with patience and precision, he was able to contain potential threats before they escalated, maintaining operational stability while signaling to both loyalists and potential betrayers that loyalty and discretion were essential. This delicate balancing act required exceptional judgment, timing, and psychological acuity. The dynamics of betrayal also affected the culture of the organization. Massino had spent years cultivating trust and loyalty through careful attention, recognition, and strategic reward. Now, the emergence of disloyalty threatened to undermine the cohesion he had built. He responded by reinforcing expectations subtly, reminding associates of their obligations while demonstrating that competence and discretion were valued and protected. These measures maintained morale, ensured continued operational efficiency, and reduced the likelihood of further betrayals. By managing perception as carefully as behavior, Massino navigated a situation that could have destabilized the family entirely. One of the most challenging aspects of internal betrayal was its unpredictability. Unlike rival factions or external threats, disloyal associates could operate under the radar, their intentions hidden until the moment of exposure. Massino relied on his years of observation and psychological insight to detect patterns, anticipate actions, and identify potential vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. This proactive approach allowed him to address threats quietly and strategically, rather than reacting after damage had been done. The ability to read subtle cues, interpret behavior, and anticipate consequences became indispensable, highlighting the intricate interplay between operational skill and human insight in maintaining authority. The legal and operational consequences of betrayal were also profound. Information obtained from informants could expose entire operations, endanger associates, and compromise revenue streams. Massino had to assess the credibility of each threat, determine the potential impact, and implement strategies to mitigate exposure. This often involved reorganizing operations, adjusting communications, and enhancing security protocols, all while maintaining the appearance of stability and authority. The dual demands of managing both operational continuity and the psychological impact of betrayal created a complex, high-stakes environment in which every decision required careful deliberation. At the same time, Massino recognized that betrayal could serve as an opportunity for strategic advantage. By identifying those who were disloyal, he could recalibrate alliances, strengthen relationships with reliable associates, and consolidate his authority. Even the most carefully constructed empire can begin to show signs of vulnerability, and for Joe Massino, the cracks in the Bonanno family's operations became increasingly evident as the early 2000s unfolded. Years of disciplined leadership, strategic foresight, and meticulous management could not fully insulate him from the pressures of modern law enforcement, internal betrayal, and the unpredictable dynamics of organized crime. These cracks were subtle at first, minor missteps, delayed communications, and hints of discontent among associates, but over time they became impossible to ignore. For a man who had built his life on careful observation and calculated action, the emergence of these vulnerabilities introduced a profound tension between control and uncertainty. The first signs of weakness often appeared in operational challenges. Some crews began to falter in executing assignments with the precision that Massino had instilled over decades. Small errors, overlooked protocols, or lapses in discretion revealed the fragility of even the most disciplined structures. These operational flaws, though minor individually, cumulatively undermined the perception of stability and competence that had been central to Massino's authority. The very systems he had carefully designed to maintain efficiency were being tested in ways he could not entirely control, highlighting the vulnerability inherent in any complex criminal organization. Internal dynamics also contributed to these cracks. Years of loyalty and careful relationship building could not entirely mitigate the impact of pressure, ambition, or fear among associates. Informants, coerced by federal authorities, began to emerge from the ranks, creating uncertainty and distrust. Those who had once been steadfast allies might now act out of self-preservation, betraying confidential information or refusing to carry out orders. Massino understood that the human element was both the family's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Managing these relationships required constant vigilance, strategic intervention, and a careful calibration of authority and influence to maintain cohesion. The pressure from law enforcement intensified the sense of instability. The FBI and federal prosecutors were relentless, employing sophisticated surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover operations to expose vulnerabilities and exploit weaknesses. Every conversation, meeting, and transaction carried the risk of exposure, creating a constant background tension that influenced decision-making. Massino's awareness of these pressures demanded heightened caution, careful compartmentalization of information, and strategic adjustments to operations. Even with his extensive experience, he recognized that the margin for error had narrowed considerably, and that the careful balancing act he had perfected over decades required even greater precision. Cracks in the empire were also evident in the subtle erosion of morale among associates. Uncertainty, fear of legal exposure, and the realization that loyalty could no longer be assumed created a psychological strain on the organization. Massino observed these dynamics closely, noting shifts in behavior, hesitation in executing orders, and subtle signs of anxiety or discontent. These observations informed his responses, prompting a combination of reassurance, reinforcement of loyalty, and strategic reassignment of responsibilities. By addressing vulnerabilities proactively, he sought to maintain operational continuity while mitigating the risks posed by uncertainty and wavering allegiance. Financial pressures added another layer of complexity. Even the most profitable operations were subject to scrutiny, mismanagement, or compromise due to leaks or operational errors. Maintaining the flow of revenue required careful monitoring, adjustment of protocols, and strategic oversight. Massino's meticulous attention to these details reflected both his operational competence and his understanding of the broader implications of financial stability. Any disruption could not only threaten the family's economic foundation but also weaken his authority and influence, amplifying the cracks already emerging in the organization. The emergence of rival factions and subtle power struggles within the family further contributed to the sense of vulnerability. Ambitious members, sensing the shifting dynamics, began testing boundaries and seeking opportunities to elevate their status. These challenges required a delicate blend of diplomacy, subtle deterrence, and strategic influence. Massino could not rely solely on his established authority. He had to actively guide behavior, anticipate ambitions, and manage potential conflicts with precision. The interplay of ambition, fear, and loyalty created a complex social landscape that demanded constant attention and adaptability. The psychological burden of these cracks was significant. Massino, accustomed to managing threats and controlling operations with confidence, now faced a landscape in which uncertainty had grown pervasive. The realization that even the most loyal associates could act against him, and that external pressures were escalating, required heightened vigilance, emotional resilience, and strategic recalibration. Maintaining composure while assessing risk, guiding behavior, and managing the family's operations became a constant, high-stakes endeavor. Every decision carried amplified consequences, and the pressure to preserve both authority and operational integrity weighed heavily on his judgment and planning. Strategic foresight remained Massino's most valuable tool during this period. He carefully mapped potential scenarios, anticipating how internal fractures, legal pressure, or rival ambitions could manifest. By envisioning multiple outcomes and preparing contingency plans, he was able to act proactively rather than reactively, preserving stability and minimizing damage. This level of anticipation required both experience and psychological insight, allowing Massino to navigate a landscape in which vulnerabilities were multiplying and the consequences of miscalculation were severe. As the pressures surrounding Joe Massino intensified, the landscape of the Bonanno family, and indeed his own life, began to shift in ways that demanded not only operational skill but profound psychological acuity. The cracks that had been gradually appearing over the previous years were now more than visible. They were structural, signaling that the carefully balanced empire he had built could no longer rely solely on loyalty, discretion, and strategic planning. Associates who had been stalwart allies were being tested, not just by their own ambitions but by the relentless and sophisticated efforts of federal authorities. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was real, immediate, and constantly evolving. Massino, who had navigated decades of rivalries, betrayals, and complex operations, now faced a crucible of pressure that would test every lesson he had learned from the streets of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of the Bonanno family. Federal authorities had become increasingly adept at exploiting vulnerabilities within organized crime networks. Wiretaps, undercover agents, and informants created a network of surveillance that could penetrate even the most carefully controlled operations. Massino, despite his decades of experience and disciplined approach, had to confront the reality that the methods of law enforcement were now capable of bypassing traditional operational defenses. Every meeting, every phone call, every financial transaction carried potential exposure. The challenge was not only to preserve operational efficiency but also to maintain trust, loyalty, and morale within the family under conditions of extraordinary pressure. The psychological strain of this environment was substantial. Massino understood that fear, uncertainty, and doubt could easily destabilize the organization. Associates were acutely aware that their actions could have legal consequences, and this awareness sometimes caused hesitation, miscommunication, or even disloyalty. Those who had been reliable under normal circumstances were now vulnerable to persuasion or coercion, and the very people he depended upon to maintain the family's operations could become liabilities. The subtle dynamics of trust, perception, and loyalty became more important than ever, and Massino's ability to read these dynamics determined both his authority and the continued functioning of the Bonanno family. Internal betrayal emerged as a profound challenge. Long-standing associates, faced with the pressures of indictments, plea deals, and the promise of leniency, began to cooperate with authorities. For Massino, this was a double-edged sword. The information they provided could compromise operations and associates, but it also offered insights into vulnerabilities that could be addressed proactively. Massino responded with a combination of vigilance, discretion, and strategic intervention. He monitored behavior, reassigned responsibilities, and subtly reinforced loyalty among those he could still rely upon. By acting carefully and deliberately, he mitigated some risks, but the realization that even the closest allies could turn against him introduced a new layer of complexity to his leadership. The operational challenges imposed by these pressures were immense. Even routine activities had to be scrutinized for potential exposure, and operational protocols had to be adjusted to account for increased scrutiny. Meetings were conducted with heightened attention to security, communications were monitored for potential leaks, and financial transactions were managed with extreme care. Massino's decades of experience in operational management allowed him to implement these measures effectively, but they also added to the psychological burden of leadership. Each decision carried amplified consequences, and the margin for error had never been smaller. Massino also had to navigate the evolving dynamics of loyalty. Associates who had once been steadfast could now be swayed by fear, self-interest, or legal incentives. The management of human behavior became as critical as the management of operations. Massino relied on a combination of subtle psychological influence, strategic rewards, and discreet deterrence to maintain cohesion. By observing behavior, anticipating motives, and guiding decision-making, he was able to preserve loyalty among key personnel. Yet the challenge remained constant, trust was no longer guaranteed, and the very foundation of his authority rested on an intricate web of perception, influence, and careful management of human psychology. The emergence of legal pressure also introduced the need for long-term contingency planning. Massino understood that arrests, indictments, or exposure could disrupt not only individual operations but the structure of the family as a whole. Strategic foresight became critical. He assessed potential vulnerabilities, developed multiple response scenarios, and prepared for the possibility that his control might be compromised. These plans were executed with discretion, ensuring that the family could continue operating even as federal investigations intensified. Massino's capacity to anticipate and respond to threats highlighted the depth of his strategic insight and operational discipline. The social dynamics within the family were equally challenging. Internal rivalries, previously managed through subtle influence and negotiation, became more pronounced under the combined pressures of betrayal and law enforcement scrutiny. Ambitious members tested boundaries, associates hesitated in executing directives, and minor conflicts threatened to escalate. Massino responded with a combination of diplomacy, psychological insight, and strategic intervention. By managing disputes quietly and guiding behavior with precision, he maintained cohesion and minimized the risk of internal collapse. The delicate balance of authority, perception, and loyalty became increasingly central to the survival of both the family and his own leadership. Despite these pressures, Massino maintained a calm, measured authority. He projected confidence and stability, reassuring loyal associates and deterring potential challengers. The mounting pressures of law enforcement, internal betrayal, and operational vulnerabilities eventually brought Joe Massino to a crossroads that no leader ever wishes to encounter. For decades, he had relied on patience, strategic foresight, and psychological insight to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime, carefully managing alliances, resolving disputes, and maintaining a tightly controlled empire. But the convergence of federal investigations, the increasing number of associates cooperating with authorities, and the heightened risk of personal exposure created a reality in which survival required a choice: continue to resist at potentially catastrophic personal cost, or take measures that would fundamentally alter the landscape of his life and legacy. This was the moment that would test not only his intelligence and strategic skill but also the very instincts that had carried him from the streets of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of the Bonanno family. Massino's reputation had always been grounded in discretion and subtlety. He had avoided the flamboyance that characterized other bosses, understanding that overt attention invited both rival aggression and legal scrutiny. Yet, as the early 2000s progressed, it became increasingly apparent that discretion alone was no longer sufficient to protect him. Associates who had once been steadfast were now cooperating with federal prosecutors, providing information that could unravel years of careful operational planning. The risk of indictment, trial, and incarceration loomed over him, not as a distant possibility but as a real and immediate threat. Massino was forced to confront a stark truth: the very systems of loyalty and discretion he had cultivated were beginning to fail under unprecedented pressure. The gravity of the situation required a recalibration of strategy. Massino understood that traditional approaches, reliance on loyalty, subtle influence, and operational compartmentalization, would not guarantee survival in the face of coordinated federal pressure. He faced a paradox: the very people he depended on to maintain the family's operations were the same individuals whose cooperation with authorities could now threaten his freedom. This created a tense, high-stakes environment in which every decision carried amplified consequences. The margin for error had narrowed dramatically, demanding a level of foresight and calculation that few leaders in the underworld had ever been required to exercise. The psychological dimension of this dilemma was profound. Massino had spent decades mastering the art of reading human behavior, managing perception, and guiding loyalty. Yet the emergence of informants and cooperating witnesses introduced a level of unpredictability that challenged even his acute observational skills. Each interaction, conversation, and assignment now had the potential to carry unforeseen risk. Massino had to weigh trust against suspicion, loyalty against self-interest, and operational efficiency against the potential for exposure. The constant tension between these competing factors created a mental landscape in which strategic clarity was both essential and extraordinarily difficult to maintain. At the same time, the legal environment had become increasingly sophisticated. Federal authorities were employing a combination of surveillance, electronic monitoring, and legal pressure to gather evidence, build cases, and induce cooperation. The traditional tools of mafia leadership, intimidation, influence, and loyalty, were insufficient to counter these modern investigative techniques. Massino recognized that survival now depended on integrating these new realities into his decision-making framework, balancing risk management, operational continuity, and personal security in ways that were unprecedented in his long career. The choice Massino faced was not merely operational but profoundly moral and psychological. He had built his life on a code of loyalty, discretion, and honor, principles that had guided him from his early days on the streets of Brooklyn to the leadership of the Bonanno family. To act in a way that compromised these principles, by turning against associates or cooperating with authorities himself, would represent a fundamental departure from the values he had cultivated over decades. Yet, the alternative was potentially catastrophic. Continued resistance could lead to imprisonment for life, exposure of the family's operations, and the destruction of the very empire he had spent decades building. The tension between survival and principle created a crucible in which Massino's judgment, experience, and instincts were tested to their fullest extent. Strategically, Massino recognized that the safest path required action that was both decisive and controlled. By selectively cooperating with authorities, he could manage the pace and scope of exposure, retain a degree of personal agency, and potentially mitigate the consequences of legal action. This approach demanded careful planning, precise execution, and rigorous control over information. Every disclosure had to be measured, every communication calculated, and every action aligned with the objective of preserving both personal survival and operational continuity as far as possible. In this sense, Massino's choice was not one of impulsive surrender but a continuation of the same strategic thinking that had guided him throughout his career. The psychological weight of this decision was immense. Cooperating with authorities required the re-evaluation of relationships, the acknowledgement of betrayal by associates, and the acceptance of personal and reputational consequences. Massino had to reconcile his own sense of identity, cultivated over decades in a world governed by loyalty and discretion, with the practical necessity of survival. The emotional complexity of this period cannot be overstated. It demanded the integration of operational intelligence, strategic foresight, and emotional resilience in a way that few leaders in any context are ever required to exercise. Even as he contemplated the implications of cooperation, Massino maintained a disciplined approach to operational management. He continued to oversee the Bonanno family's activities, ensuring that ongoing operations were stable, profitable, and insulated as much as possible from exposure. This required an extraordinary balancing act, maintaining authority and cohesion internally while simultaneously preparing for the legal realities that could disrupt the organization. Massino's ability to integrate these dual priorities, internal management and external negotiation, demonstrated the depth of his strategic and operational skill. The inevitability of exposure also forced Massino to confront the reality of consequences beyond the immediate family. Associates, some of whom had remained loyal for decades, now faced legal jeopardy, and the choices he made would influence their fates as well as his own. Every decision about disclosure, cooperation, or operational adjustment had cascading effects, impacting not only the stability of the organization but also the lives of individuals who had trusted and followed him. This network of interdependencies required an extraordinary level of foresight, judgment, and moral calculation, highlighting the complex interplay between authority, loyalty, and personal survival in a high-stakes environment. Ultimately, the decisions Massino made during this period reflected a culmination of his lifelong skills, strategic foresight, operational discipline, psychological insight, and the ability to adapt to unprecedented challenges. He recognized that survival in the modern criminal landscape required the integration of multiple domains of expertise, balancing loyalty, perception, risk, and personal safety in a carefully orchestrated strategy. This moment, the convergence of internal betrayal, legal pressure, and operational vulnerability, represented both the greatest challenge and the ultimate test of his leadership. Massino's response to this high-stakes scenario highlights the complexities of leadership in organized crime. The choices he faced were not simply tactical, they were existential, encompassing considerations of morality, loyalty, survival, and legacy. By applying the same principles that had guided him throughout his career, observation, patience, strategic calculation, and psychological insight, he navigated this period with a degree of control and composure that few could have achieved. Yet the consequences of these choices would irrevocably alter the course of his life, the structure of the Bonanno family, and the perception of his legacy within the criminal world. In this period, Massino's experience exemplifies the delicate balance between power and vulnerability, authority and survival, loyalty and pragmatism. The convergence of internal betrayal and external legal pressure required a level of strategic thinking that went beyond operational competence. It demanded the integration of psychological insight, foresight, and moral calculation, allowing Massino to make decisions that preserved his life, mitigated legal consequences, and maintained as much control over the family's operations as possible. This period represents a defining chapter in his story, illustrating both the fragility of criminal empires and the extraordinary skill required to navigate the intersection of law, loyalty, and survival at the highest levels of organized crime. As the weight of impending legal consequences bore down upon Joe Massino, the world he had meticulously constructed over decades began to feel less stable, less predictable, and more treacherous than ever. The structures of loyalty, authority, and operational control that had guided him from his early days on Brooklyn streets to the pinnacle of the Bonanno family were now under unprecedented pressure. Informants within the family, coupled with the relentless methods of federal prosecutors and the sophisticated surveillance techniques of the FBI, introduced a level of uncertainty that even a seasoned strategist like Massino could not entirely eliminate. Every decision he made, every interaction he engaged in, and every step forward carried with it heightened consequences. Survival, once managed through discretion, patience, and careful observation, now required a recalibration of every principle that had previously governed his actions. The reality of potential exposure created a psychological tension that infiltrated all aspects of Massino's life. He had spent decades mastering the interplay of trust, loyalty, and influence, and yet even the most reliable allies were now vulnerable to pressure, incentives, and fear. Individuals who had been cornerstones of operational stability could now act unpredictably under the threat of legal jeopardy. Massino, whose career had been defined by a deep understanding of human behavior, now had to account for variables that were not entirely within his control. The very foundations of authority were being tested, and the challenge of maintaining cohesion while protecting himself became a daily, high-stakes exercise in judgment and foresight. Federal pressure was relentless, and its effects were systemic. Massino understood that the sophistication of investigative techniques, wiretaps, undercover operations, and the strategic use of cooperating witnesses, was designed to exploit the smallest vulnerability. Operations that had functioned smoothly for decades now had to be re-evaluated, secured, and, in some cases, restructured entirely. Every meeting had to be scrutinized, every conversation measured, and every piece of information considered for its potential to compromise the family or himself. This heightened scrutiny created an environment in which operational efficiency, psychological insight, and strategic calculation were inseparable. Massino's response required the integration of these skills at a level he had never before encountered, demanding both vigilance and adaptability simultaneously. The role of informants within the family introduced profound complications. Massino had long understood that loyalty was not absolute and that trust could be fragile, but the emergence of cooperating witnesses under federal pressure added a level of immediacy and unpredictability. Individuals who had been loyal for years could now act in ways that undermined operations and exposed sensitive information. Massino's strategy for mitigating this risk was multifaceted. He reinforced loyalty among trusted associates, reassigned critical responsibilities, and monitored behavior closely for subtle indications of compromise. This delicate balancing act required him to navigate interpersonal dynamics with precision, applying both reward and deterrence strategically to maintain cohesion and operational integrity. The psychological impact of these developments cannot be overstated. Massino, accustomed to managing threats through observation, subtle influence, and strategic foresight, now faced variables that introduced uncertainty into every interaction. Decisions were no longer guided solely by operational considerations or long-term planning, they also had to account for the behavior of individuals under duress, the potential for betrayal, and the unpredictable strategies of law enforcement. Every choice carried amplified consequences, requiring careful deliberation, foresight, and an acute understanding of human psychology. The stakes were existential, affecting not only his authority but also his freedom, legacy, and the lives of those who remained loyal. Financial and operational management became increasingly complex under these conditions. Even the most carefully monitored operations were vulnerable to exposure, error, or compromise. The flow of funds, the execution of assignments, and the management of crews had to be adjusted continuously to reduce risk. Massino applied his long-honed skills in oversight, compartmentalization, and risk assessment to preserve operational continuity, while simultaneously preparing for scenarios in which certain ventures or individuals could no longer be relied upon. This dual focus required a disciplined approach to both short-term operational challenges and long-term strategic planning, ensuring that the family remained functional even as the external pressures intensified. The challenge of maintaining authority under these conditions required a careful interplay of visibility and subtlety. Massino understood that projecting calm, measured control could reinforce loyalty and deter challenges, even as the internal and external pressures grew. By maintaining the appearance of stability and competence, he reassured associates and created a psychological barrier against the escalation of doubt or fear. Simultaneously, he implemented operational and strategic adjustments quietly, ensuring that the family's core functions remained insulated from exposure. This dual approach, combining psychological influence with strategic recalibration, was essential to sustaining authority in an environment where perception was as critical as reality. Timing became an increasingly crucial element of Massino's strategy. Every decision, from reassigning responsibilities to engaging in selective disclosures, had to be executed with precise consideration of context, risk, and potential outcomes. Acting too quickly could provoke unnecessary exposure or mistrust, while delaying action could allow vulnerabilities to expand or be exploited by law enforcement. Massino relied on a lifetime of observation and experience to assess these temporal dynamics, making calculated moves that maximized advantage while minimizing risk. This mastery of timing, honed over decades, became a critical tool in navigating an environment where traditional mechanisms of control were no longer sufficient. Even as he adapted to these pressures, Massino remained acutely aware of the human cost of his decisions. Associates faced legal jeopardy, families were impacted, and loyalties were tested under extreme conditions. Each adjustment he made in operations or strategy had cascading effects, influencing not only the structural stability of the family but also the psychological state and behavior of those under his command. Managing this network of interdependencies required extraordinary judgment, empathy, and foresight, ensuring that interventions maintained cohesion without inadvertently creating new risks or fractures. Ultimately, this period represented the culmination of all the challenges Massino had faced throughout his life, the intersection of operational complexity, human unpredictability, and external scrutiny. As Joe Massino navigated the crescendo of legal pressure and internal betrayal, he entered a period that would ultimately define the closing chapters of his life as a mafia boss. The empire he had meticulously constructed over decades was under siege, not from a single rival or event, but from a convergence of forces, law enforcement scrutiny, disloyal associates, and the evolving dynamics of organized crime itself. Every day demanded heightened vigilance, every decision carried amplified consequences, and every interaction required careful calibration. This period represented both the culmination of his strategic life and the introduction of unprecedented uncertainty, a moment where the lessons of decades were tested under conditions that even the most seasoned leader could not fully control. The legal landscape that Massino faced had evolved significantly since the early years of his career. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and sophisticated federal investigative strategies had transformed the methods by which authorities could penetrate criminal networks. Associates who had once been loyal were now cooperating with prosecutors, providing testimony and information that could dismantle the carefully structured empire Massino had built. He understood that these developments were not merely operational challenges, they represented existential threats to his freedom, reputation, and legacy. The weight of potential exposure forced him to reevaluate strategies, relationships, and priorities, balancing the immediate needs of survival with the long-term implications of every action. Internal betrayal had become a defining factor in this high-stakes environment. Massino had long relied on trust and loyalty to maintain operational cohesion, yet the pressures exerted by legal authorities revealed the fragility of these relationships. Associates who had once followed orders without question were now faced with personal risk and were compelled to act in ways that could compromise the organization. This introduced a layer of unpredictability that complicated even routine decision-making. Massino's approach to managing these dynamics combined observation, psychological insight, and strategic intervention. He monitored behavior, reassigned responsibilities, and employed subtle incentives and deterrents to maintain as much loyalty as possible while mitigating the operational risks posed by disloyalty. The psychological strain of these pressures was profound. Massino had been trained to anticipate behavior, to influence perception, and to manage loyalty over decades of experience. Yet the emergence of informants and cooperating witnesses introduced variables that were outside his control. Each interaction carried the potential for disclosure, and even a single lapse could unravel years of careful planning. Massino's decision-making had to integrate operational priorities, human psychology, and legal risk simultaneously. The constant tension between these domains required exceptional judgment, patience, and adaptability. His ability to maintain composure and execute strategy under such pressure became a defining feature of this period. Operationally, the Bonanno family faced unprecedented challenges. The flow of information, financial management, and execution of assignments all had to be re-evaluated under the scrutiny of federal authorities. Previously reliable protocols were now vulnerable to exposure, and operational compartmentalization had to be enhanced to protect both associates and the organization as a whole. Massino's attention to detail, honed over decades, allowed him to implement these adjustments effectively. Meetings were carefully structured, communications were monitored, and sensitive tasks were reassigned to trusted individuals. Every operational decision was weighed for its potential consequences, and every adjustment reflected a combination of foresight and adaptability. Financial operations, a cornerstone of the family's stability, were particularly sensitive. Income streams derived from loan sharking, gambling, and legitimate businesses were now vulnerable to disruption from both informants and legal intervention. Massino responded by strengthening oversight, compartmentalizing responsibilities, and ensuring that critical operations remained under the control of the most trusted and discreet associates. This meticulous approach preserved profitability and minimized exposure, yet it also highlighted the precariousness of even the most disciplined structures when faced with systemic pressure. The balance between perception and reality became increasingly central to Massino's leadership. Even as operational vulnerabilities multiplied, he needed to project an image of stability, competence, and authority to both internal and external audiences. This psychological management was critical. Loyal associates required reassurance that the family remained cohesive, while rivals needed to perceive Massino's continued strength to deter opportunistic challenges. By maintaining this controlled perception, he reinforced both internal cohesion and external influence, creating a buffer against the destabilizing effects of betrayal and legal scrutiny. The management of human behavior remained paramount. Massino's strategy relied on subtle cues, selective incentives, and careful interventions to guide decision-making and maintain loyalty. Individuals were monitored for signs of hesitation, uncertainty, or potential cooperation with authorities. Subtle adjustments, such as reassigning responsibilities, providing recognition, or applying discreet pressure, were employed to reinforce allegiance and mitigate risks. The interplay between authority, perception, and loyalty required constant attention, and Massino's mastery of this dynamic was a critical factor in sustaining control over the organization during a period of unprecedented vulnerability. Timing and strategic foresight became more crucial than ever. Every move had to be carefully considered. Premature actions could provoke resistance or exposure, while delayed responses could allow vulnerabilities to expand. In the quiet aftermath of decades spent navigating the perilous world of organized crime, Joe Massino's story settles into a period of reflection, consequence, and legacy. For a man who had spent his life balancing loyalty, power, and survival, the final chapters are as revealing as the rise itself, offering insights into the complexities of leadership, human behavior, and the relentless pressures that define life at the apex of the mafia. Massino's career was not defined solely by the accumulation of authority or wealth, but by the skillful navigation of a landscape where every decision could tip the balance between survival and disaster. It was a life shaped by observation, patience, and strategic foresight, culminating in both triumphs and compromises that reflect the intricate interplay between ambition, loyalty, and reality. As the weight of federal scrutiny, internal betrayal, and operational vulnerability pressed ever closer, Massino faced the profound reality that even the most disciplined and experienced leaders are ultimately constrained by circumstances beyond their control. The legal machinery arrayed against him was precise, relentless, and adaptive, capable of exploiting vulnerabilities in ways that no individual could fully anticipate. Even as he had meticulously managed his operations, cultivated loyalty, and anticipated the behavior of rivals and associates, the convergence of these forces created a scenario in which survival required both extraordinary adaptability and a willingness to make decisions that were previously unimaginable. Central to this final phase was the recognition of the fragility of loyalty. Associates who had once been steadfast, who had followed orders without question and executed operations with precision, were now susceptible to legal pressure, coercion, and personal incentive. Massino understood that trust, which had been the foundation of his leadership, could be tested under extreme circumstances. This recognition necessitated a recalibration of strategy. Loyalty could not be assumed, and survival demanded that each relationship, each decision, and each operational task be carefully assessed for risk. The intricate web of trust, influence, and psychological insight that had long underpinned his authority was now tested to its limits, highlighting the human dimension of leadership in an environment defined by both opportunity and peril. Massino's response to these pressures demonstrated a remarkable combination of foresight, discipline, and strategic judgment. Rather than reacting impulsively to the mounting threats, he relied on the same principles that had guided his rise: careful observation, the anticipation of human behavior, and the measured orchestration of both perception and reality. He reinforced loyalty where it could be maintained, restructured operations to protect the organization's critical functions, and adjusted his interactions to minimize exposure while maintaining authority. Every decision was a delicate balance between risk and necessity, illustrating the depth of strategic thinking required to navigate a period in which the familiar rules of leadership had been profoundly altered. The operational adjustments required during this time were extensive. Communications were carefully monitored and compartmentalized to reduce the risk of leaks. Meetings and transactions were conducted with heightened security, and responsibilities were reassigned to trusted associates whose reliability could be confirmed. Even routine activities demanded extraordinary attention, as minor lapses could have cascading consequences. Massino's ability to integrate operational precision with strategic foresight allowed him to maintain continuity despite the intense pressures surrounding him, demonstrating a mastery of organizational control even in the face of systemic vulnerability. Financial oversight also became a critical element of survival. The family's revenue streams, derived from a combination of traditional criminal enterprises and legitimate businesses, were vulnerable to disruption from legal intervention and the exposure of associates. Massino applied meticulous oversight, reallocating responsibilities, reinforcing protocols, and ensuring that key operations were insulated from potential compromise. This attention to detail, combined with his understanding of both human behavior and legal risk, allowed him to preserve operational functionality while navigating an environment in which every transaction carried heightened consequences. The psychological dimension of this period cannot be understated. Massino faced a complex interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, and pressure. Associates were operating under the dual influence of loyalty to the family and self-preservation, a tension that threatened cohesion and stability. Massino's response required both empathy and subtle guidance. He had to reinforce loyalty without appearing coercive, deter disloyalty without provoking confrontation, and maintain operational focus while navigating the uncertainty of human behavior. This intricate management of perception and reality became as central to survival as the management of finances, operations, or territory. Massino's strategic foresight extended beyond immediate survival to considerations of legacy. He was acutely aware that the decisions made in this period would shape the historical perception of his leadership and the narrative of the Bonanno family itself. Each choice, whether to cooperate with authorities, protect associates, or restructure operations, carried implications for how his life and career would be judged. Massino approached these decisions with the same deliberation and careful calculation that had guided his rise, recognizing that legacy, like power, is built through a combination of action, perception, and timing. The eventual reality of cooperation with federal authorities represented both a pragmatic choice and a profound turning point. Massino had spent a lifetime balancing loyalty, trust, and survival, and the decision to provide information, even selectively, was not taken lightly. It reflected the culmination of decades of strategic thinking applied to a scenario in which traditional mechanisms of control were insufficient to ensure personal and operational survival. This choice was emblematic of the complex calculus of leadership in organized crime. Survival, operational continuity, and the mitigation of consequences required decisions that often conflicted with long-standing codes, principles, and personal values. Even as Massino's empire began to face structural change, his influence and presence remained palpable. The networks he had built, the culture of discipline and observation he had cultivated, and the operational and strategic frameworks he had established continued to shape behavior, guide decisions, and maintain cohesion among those who remained loyal. His legacy, therefore, is not defined solely by the legal outcomes or the eventual collapse of certain operations, but by the skills, insights, and strategic mastery that allowed him to maintain authority and navigate unprecedented pressures for decades.